All right, I just wanted to start off lecture today by reminding you about the final exam. I know it's all kind of like the impending doom at the end of the semester here. But I just want to remind you that those semi-cumulative questions, right, I'm giving you ahead of time. You should be able to answer them because you can use your notes to answer them and then just remember what you wrote down, right? That's 20 points or like 31% of your final grade. That's a huge chunk of points you're getting ahead of time. Make sure you do not neglect those. Study guide is complete. It is on Moodle. If you don't get to any content today, I will strike through any questions that I want to expect you to know. Hardy-Weinberg practice problems. Yes, there will be a Hardy-Weinberg question. Right? I will provide calculators during the final exam time. Let's see. Review day, next class period on Wednesday. So this is the last content that you will get for Bio 101. I'll have some practice exam problems, and then I do have that additional study session on Wednesday at 3:30. So, lots of study tools out there. Right? Final exam is 1 week from today. If you have any questions, let me know. I do not have office hours tomorrow, as per the email I sent out last week, but I will have them on Wednesday. Any questions before we dive into the last bit of content? All right, well, let's talk about our last topic. We're going to touch upon community and ecosystems. We're really just touching surface level on these two types of ecological measures because we just simply ran out of time in the semester, right? There's so much more we could learn about these. I just want to start us off by saying we are going to be specifically looking at community ecology, right, which is something we looked at last Friday when we talked about species interactions. So community ecologies, we're studying how groups of species interact with one another and form these functional communities in the environment. All right, when we're talking about community ecology, welcome. Oh, thank you, subtitles, yes. Walked in right away and you immediately knew. I like it. All right, when we're talking about community ecology, there's some measures that we can make of communities that help tell us maybe how healthy this community is. One of those measures is species richness. All right, so that's the number of species in each community, right? So we're just counting up how many species are there, right? Now, species richness is going to vary geographically, right? And I'm actually going to switch to the next slide here, which expands upon these geographic concepts. You look at the map here, you can notice that there tends to be more species or a higher species richness, right, when we get to more tropical areas, and very few species in the polar areas. Right, so these cooler temperatures of the purples and the blues here represents a lower species richness. These warmer temperatures, these yellows, these reds represent a really high species richness. So there tends to be more species in the tropics, right? It tends to increase by topographical variation, right? So if you have mountains per se, right, now you have all that other elevation that communities can take advantage of, which provides more habitats, right? You have more peaks, you have more valleys, you have more habitats. And we can see that kind of in the Rocky Mountains here and in the Sierra Nevadas. There tends to be little pockets of areas with higher species richness, so more species. And we also see this peninsular effect, right? So in peninsulas, the further you get away from the mainland, the fewer species you have. Species would decrease. So in Baja California here, we see fewer species on the extremmost end of the peninsula. Same with Florida here, we see fewer species the further we get away from our large land mass. Right? So we tend to see these geographical patterns of species richness emerging. All right, but species richness is not the only measure that you can use to describe a community, right? You're also concerned about relative abundance, right? So how frequent are those species? So if we look at these two communities up on the screen here, right, we can see that the relative abundance of species A, B, C, and D is pretty consistent in community 1. They're all at about 25%. Right? But community 2, it's a bit more skewed. Right? Species A takes up 80% of all the individuals in that community. Right? Whereas species B and C are only represented about 5% of the time. Right? So relative abundance is also very important to look at. In the example of this table here, right, you might have two communities that have the same exact richness. Right? So they have the same number of species. In this case, they have 2 species. Right? And it just so happens there's 100 individuals in each species here. Right? But we can see community A, 99% of those individuals all fall under species 1. Right? Whereas community B, it's split in a more 50-50 fashion. Right? So relative abundance can tell us something about that species composition in an area, which plays into our next term or our next measure of a community here, which would be species diversity. Right? So species diversity is more all-encompassing of a measure because it measures diversity by incorporating the species number, right? So we're incorporating richness, but we're also taking into account relative abundance. Right? So not only looking at how many species there are, but the abundance of each species together. That would be species diversity. And of course, we can measure this in a community using a wonderful math equation. All right, so again, this math equation I'm not going to expect you to memorize, but I would expect you to know how to apply the results of this equation. Right? And we're going to go through this here. So the Shannon Diversity Index is one major way that a lot of community ecologists will measure species diversity in a community. Right? And this diversity index will take into account, right, the number of individuals in each species, right, so taking into account the abundance, as well as the total number of species in a community. Right? So you would take the proportion of individuals in a species times the natural logarithm of the number of individuals in that species. We do that for every species. We add it all together, and we would get this diversity index. All right. So to kind of emphasize how this works, right, we're going to look at a hypothetical community. Right. We have a community of 5 species, right, a total of 100 individuals. And so if we were to do this Shannon Diversity Index, you would likely make a table like so, right, where you list out all the species. Right? We know we have 5 species here, so species 1 through 5 is listed. We would take the abundance of each species. So there are 50 individuals of species 1, only 1 individual of species 5. Right? We would look at the proportion of individuals within a species. Right? Which, to do that, we would simply take the number of individuals divided by the overall number of individuals in that community. Right? So if there's 50 species 1, right, we'll divide that by the total number of individuals of 100. And we would get that proportion of 0.5. We would take the natural log of that number, right, calculate that out, and then we would multiply it again back by that original proportion number to get that final number that we are interested in, right? Which in and of itself doesn't tells us much, but if we add them all together, this would be our diversity index, right, of 1.201. Right? So that's our Shannon Diversity Index. Now notice when we added them all together, it was a negative number. Right? But within the equation, it's the negative value of the sum of all of these values. So 2 negatives, they cancel out. We get that positive number of 1.201. Right? And this is the kind of information I would really expect you to know is how to apply that number. What does that number mean? Right? And so this value is a measure of diversity. The higher the value, the greater diversity there is in that community. Right? And really what we see for real communities out in nature, we typically get a number that falls between 1.5 and 3.5. Again, the higher the number, the greater the diversity in that community. Right? And so if we take another real world example here and take a look at these two communities that were measured before logging happened in an area and after logging happened in an area. Right? So logged sites and unlogged sites, right? They had the same species, right? So we calculated out the Shannon Diversity Index for the unlogged area of 2.284. We did the same exact thing for those logged sites, and we got 2.037. Right? And this is a great type of measure that you could say, yes, logging has some sort of impact on this community because we see a lower number, which means a lower diversity after logging occurred in these sites. Right? So it's a great way to measure maybe when disturbances happen in an area, just how much does that disturbance affect the community. Right? Diversity is important. Right? So diversity really plays into this diversity stability hypothesis. If a disturbance happens in a community, if you have a higher diversity, if you have more numbers of interacting species, that disturbance is not going to have as much of an impact as a community that has a lower diversity. Right? So the more species you have, basically the more cushioning you have. All right. All right, we are going to move on to a group question here. So I want you to compare these two communities together and figure out which one might be more stable according to that stability or diversity stability hypothesis. What is the richness of each community? And what is the relative abundance of each species, in each community? So go ahead and take a couple minutes to do so here. All right, what do we think? Which community is likely to be more stable? What's next? Yeah, likely community 2, right? They have more diversity, because if you remember, diversity is a measure of richness and abundance combined together. Right? This has a higher, this has a high richness, has a high richness, but they're also more equally important. Right? So they have a higher diversity. What about the richness for each community? What would the richness be? How many species are in each community? 3, yeah. They actually have equal richness, right? So they're equal in richness here, right? And if we look at the relative abundance of each species in each community here, I won't ask you to answer this because it's a lot of numbers, but you would simply add up how many individuals are in, or for each species are in the community, right? And we tend to see community 2 has a more even abundance of individuals, which then lends itself into it being a more stable community. Any questions? All right, we're going to move on to the next topic of community ecology, which would be successional change. Right? So succession are these gradual but continuous changes in a community, in the community structure and function over time. Right? And so succession can be a couple of different types. We're going to talk about primary succession first. Right? So this is where we have individuals forming a community or coming in and establishing themselves on pretty much barren land. Right? Land that does not have any vegetation, doesn't even have any soil. Right? So examples of these would be when glaciers retreat. Right? So here we have our glacier. After it has retreated here, it kind of leaves this barren surface. Everything's basically been eroded and scraped away. Right? This would be a great area where we could get primary succession. Right? Same with like volcanic eruptions. Right? Volcanic eruptions, they spew lava. That lava will eventually harden, right, and become a volcanic rock on which there's no soil, there's no vegetation. So the act of these areas getting that vegetation, building those communities, would be primary succession, right? Which is different from the second type of succession we'll talk about, which is secondary succession, right? So this is individuals, species coming into a community, but they're coming into an area that had previously supported life, right? So it's undergone some sort of disturbance, whether that's an earthquake or fire, tornado, hurricane, flood, some sort of disturbance has happened where it's basically taken away a lot of the species, right? So here we have fire that's taken away a lot of the species, right? But we still have soil, right? It's not totally barren, right? But the act of rebuilding that community over time, right, would be secondary succession, right? So this is an area that had a community at one point, and now we're rebuilding it after a disturbance, right? So you can see our fire example here, and over time, right, we would eventually get more and more species colonizing until we get to what we would call a climax community. All right, so we're going to talk about those climax communities here. So a climax community is theorized to be the successional endpoint, right? The endpoint to succession. So we have these individuals coming in, they're colonizing these areas, they're changing the community, altering community dynamics, right? But after a while, after so many years, it's going to get to an endpoint, right? Where nothing's really going to change too much after that. And that would be the climax community, right? Now, some climax communities take a long time to get there. Others not as long a time, right? But this is kind of like that ultimate goal of succession, to create this climax community that is essentially a community very well suited for that particular environment. Nothing further is going to change after that, right? So climax community isn't always a linear thing, right? So it's not always linear in that we have a fire, and then gradually we'll have that climax community. We can get other disturbances happening along the way, right? So maybe there's a fire and the community's starting to get toward that climax community, but now maybe there's a flood and it sets it back a little bit and it has to restart over, right? So it could take a while to get to this community, right? And one of the theories of getting to this climax community, one of the theories of succession would be facilitation, right? So this is where each colonizing species is going to make the environment a little different, right? Different enough that it becomes more suitable for the next species to come in and colonize. Right? So facilitation is one of these theories. A great example of this is in Glacial Bay in Alaska here. Right? So there used to be glaciers here. Those glaciers receded. left some barren land, right? Because the land is barren, there's not even any soil. We know this is primary succession, right? And the succession that followed had this very distinct pattern to it. So if I flip to the next slide here, right, it had this very distinct pattern where at first we might have had a cyanobacteria, moss, and lichen colonizing on the rocks, right? These organisms are really good at breaking down the rock and creating soil, right? Well, now once there's soil created, other individuals can come in, like these plant species, these mountain avens, right? They were able to utilize that soil that was created, right, and come into this community, which then themselves help build up more nutrients in the soil, add more biomass, add more soil to the little bit of soil that had already existed, which allowed this elder species to come in and colonize. Right? This elder species further improved upon the environment in a way that allowed these spruce and western hemlock species to come in and colonize. Right? So each previous species added something to this area that allowed a new species to come in to this community and colonize. Right? So this is a great example of facilitation. Right? But that's not the only hypothesis out there. We can also have inhibition. Right? This is where those early colonizers, they don't make it better for other individuals to come in. In fact, they're actually going to exclude other colonists from coming into this community. Right? So basically in this model, it's whoever gets there first is going to be the best. Right? We see this a lot of times in these marine intertidal zones, right? Where there's a lot of competition for space. And in fact, one of the experiments that was done in these intertidal zones to show inhibition was on species of algae. Right? So an early colonist to these intertidal zones would be green algae, right? These uva species. Right? And what they did was they chose these two sites. In one site, they let that green algae grow how they normally would grow. They let them be the early colonists. In the other site, they removed any of that green algae. Right? They did not allow that green algae to establish. And what they were trying to see is whether this green algae excluded red algae from coming into the community. And they definitely saw this. All right, so when this green algae was removed, the red algae was able to colonize very successfully and reach these relatively large numbers in the community. Right? But if the green algae was not removed, right, that algae basically excluded the red algae from coming in. Right? And that was a great experiment to demonstrate inhibition. The presence of that green algae inhibited red algae from coming into colonize. All right, that last theory of succession would be tolerance. And this is where species that colonize an area don't really have any effect on any other species coming in. Right? They're not going to make it better. They're not going to inhibit any species coming in. Right? They're just there. Right? So it's a species that they will establish and they will remain in the environment, but they're not going to change the environment for better or for worse. And in tolerance, what we see as the community progresses through these series of successional stages, competition tends to be more of a factor here, right? So it's not really who was there first, but rather, as the community evolves, who is better at being a better competitor, right? So at first, we have a community establishing, there's lots of room, there's lots of resources. The competition intolerant species, the ones that are really not good at competition, will be able to thrive. Right? Because there's a lot of resources, they don't really need to compete against each other. But later on, right, once more space is taken up, once more of those resources are utilized, right, species that are better at competition are going to be the ones that survive in these later communities and at the climax community. Right? So competition playing more of a role here. All right, so we have these three models: facilitation, inhibition, and tolerance. All right, so facilitation, one species is making it better for the next species, right? And it just kind of goes on down the line. The next species makes it better for the species after it, so on and so forth, until we reach a climax community. Okay. Inhibition is the opposite, right? What species comes in first can inhibit the next species from coming in. And if another species comes in, right, that species could inhibit a third species from coming in, and so on. And then we have this tolerance, right, where the species that are there are really unaffected by previous colonists. And it's really competition between these species that are more at play. All right, so I have a scenario for you. Right? Plant species A is the first to colonize a newly formed volcanic island. It breaks down the hard basalt and releases nutrients into the environment. Plant species B then appears. This species utilizes the nutrients in the new soils. They grow tall, they provide habitats for insect species. The insect species will then attract birds, which then themselves will make this island home. Right? I'll give you a minute here. This should be a relatively easy one. But what successional theory is this scenario following? This is a very common scenario that plays out in nature. I get the sense everybody is having to get confusion here. So what successional theory does this scenario follow? It's facilitation, yeah. One species is making a better environment to allow the next species to come in. Right? It just keeps going on down the line. Any question on succession? All right, if you're interested in community ecology, there's some really cool examples of succession happening. Do you have a question? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. They're not going to make it a better habitat for new species, but they're not going to inhibit the new species from coming in. They're just kind of a neutral presence. Yeah. All right. We're going to touch upon some island biogeography, which is a super interesting study here. If you go on to take classes like ecology, you'll probably spend an entire unit on island biogeography. Right? So in this type of study, we're looking at succession on islands. Right? Now, an island might be the classic island, right? Piece of land surrounded by water. It could be an island in the sense that it's an area that's surrounded entirely by another habitat. Right? So I did some studies out in Idaho, and I looked at these what we call papukas, which are volcanic islands. Right? So areas where the lava flows happen and isolated other areas from each other, creating these island communities. And it wasn't your typical islands. Right? So island can be a more all-encompassing word here. So when we're talking about island biogeography, all my examples are going to focus on the typical island, right? Just for ease of your understanding here. And so when we look at islands, we tend to see succession happening on island. It's always going to reach this equilibrium number of species, right? And this is going to be determined by immigration and by extinction of species, right? But it's also going to be determined by how close an island is to the mainland or how large an island might be, right? So it's always going to reach this equilibrium number, right? That's denoted by this symbol of S with this little symbol above it, and S with the cap on it, right? And so this equilibrium number is reflecting the balance between those coming into the community and those becoming extinct in the community. Right? extinct as a species. Right? That's a thing that you want to keep separate, right? And so when we look at this equilibrium, we can look at this image up at the top here, right? As the number of species increases, so that's along the bottom axis here, right? Immigration of new species will start to decrease. So when there's not a lot of species, we can have a lot of immigration of new species. But when there's quite a few species on the island already, those rates of immigrations will start to peter out. Right? Opposite is true for extinction. At first, when there's not a lot of number of species, there's going to be hardly any extinction. But over time, as more species colonize, that species extinction rate is going to increase. Right? So extinction rate on that island. Right? But we tend to see this equilibrium start to appear, and that's where our island's diversity tends to kind of hover around. Right? And so we know that species are going to arrive at different rates. Right? We also know that extinction can accelerate as more species arrive, and there's competition for resources, which is why we see really these curved rates rather than linear lines on this graph. All right, but we could also throw in this another concept, right, based on the islands themselves. Right? So that equilibrium is going to change not only on immigration and extinction, but depending on if it's an island that's near the mainland or far away from the mainland, or whether that island is large or small, is going to affect that equilibrium number, right? So islands that are large and near other islands, right, or near other mainlands, tend to have a higher equilibrium of species. Right, so these are factors that play into this model of trying to predict what the equilibrium could be for a specific island, right? And so when we're looking at these models, we're putting in these, generating these testable predictions. So we should have the species area effect accounted for, right? So that's the number of species should increase with an increasing island size, right? There's just simply more room. And we see that with our butterfly example up here. So as the area increases, we see the number of butterfly species also increasing, right? There's just simply more room. But the number of species will also decrease with an increasing distance away from the mainland, right? And we see that with our bird species here, right? So this is the distance away from New Guinea, right? And the percentage of bird species. The further we get away from this larger island of New Guinea, right, the decreasing number of bird species there are, right? And finally, we need to consider turnover of species, right? So these communities are not stable. There's going to be species coming in and leaving constantly all the time, all right? So even though the number might be at equilibrium, you might not see those same number of species or those same exact species playing into this equilibrium number. All right, I have another group question for you all here. So I want you to look at these two examples and tell me which one you would predict to have a higher species richness. So this one has two different islands. I put little stars where those islands are. And then these are different islands too, which also have stars between two islands. If you need a visual interpretation, let me know. One or the other based on one of the three. Yeah. All right, so if we look at this map here of all these islands off the coast of Australia. We have New Caledonia and Easter Island. Which one would you predict to have a greater species richness? Yeah, New Caledonia. Yeah, exactly. Right? It's closer to the mainland of Australia. And you know that islands closer to our mainland tend to have a higher species richness than those further away, like Easter Island. What about these two other islands on this different map here in the Lesser Antilles Island, which I completely forgot where these are located. Right? Does anybody know where the Antilles Islands are? Could be in Oceania. I'd have to look it up. I forgot. But we have our two islands here, right? We have this Martinique and we have this Saint Vincent, right? Which one of these two islands would likely have a greater species richness? Martinique, yeah. It would be Martinique. We don't see a mainland, so that's not really playing a huge influence here, but rather it's the size, right? Martinique is the largest of these islands here, right? So just by having enough space, right, they're going to be able to host more species, have a higher species richness than St. Vincent or some of these other smaller islands. All right, we're gonna just briefly touch upon ecosystem ecology. So I felt like I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't talk about it at all. But when I say briefly, I mean like we have 4 slides or something like that, right? So ecosystem ecology is taking a step further in what we're looking at in the environment. So far we've been looking at community ecology and population ecology. The same species or different species interacting with one another. Now we're looking at communities of organisms, so different species interacting with each other, but also interacting with their physical space. Right? And in ecosystem ecology, we're really going to focus on big picture ideas here, like the movement of energy and materials through organisms and through their communities. Right? So we're looking at overall productivity. We're looking at energy going into the system and energy leaving the system. One of the ways we can look at ecosystem ecology is through these food chains, right? So linear depiction of how energy flows, who eats who, right? So food chain is very linear, right? We would have a primary producer, we would call that an autotroph, right? Caterpillar is going to eat the autotroph, so it's herbivore, right? This carnivore is going to eat other organisms, so it eats caterpillar. And this snake, we would call it a secondary carnivore because it eats other carnivores. It's a very linear way of showing theme going on between these different trophic levels. Right? So whether they make their own food, whether they're an herbivore, whether they're a carnivore. Right? This is not typically how it goes, right? Typically it's not this linear. And so we would have these more complex models that are a bit more accurate in depicting energy flow, right? And these would be food webs. Right? So it's not linear, it shows way more interactions, it shows how the community is much more dynamic than just caterpillar eating a plant, lizard eating caterpillar, right? In this case, we can see the lion eats several different species in this savanna, right? We can see that this harvester ant eats this star grass and also this red oak grass, but also the wildebeest is eating this red oak grass. Right? There's many different levels and more complexity to it. Right, so these living organisms, they are using energy. Right? And as each level of consumer eats the other, an amount of energy is going to be lost. Okay? So if we look at this graph, we can see an example of how energy transfer is really inefficient. So plants, right? They're the bottom of the food web here. They're a primary producer. They're creating their own food. Right? So they have a subset of energy. Right? If an herbivore were to eat that plant, they're only going to get a subset of the energy in that plant because the plant itself has to use some of its energy for its own maintenance. Right? It has to be able to grow, it has to be able to do these cellular processes. So it's going to use up some of that energy. So if we eat that plant, we're only going to get a subset of that energy available. Right? If a carnivore were to go in and eat that herbivore, again, that herbivore is going to use some of the energy that it gained from the plant for just maintaining its cellular processes. Right? So the carnivore is only going to get a subset of what the herbivore got, which in turn, the herbivore only got a subset of what the plants got. Right? And we can see as we go further up in this food web, right? So we get to finally carnivores. It's listed as carnivores 3 here. So it'd be a carnivore that eats a carnivore, which in turn eats a carnivore, right? To come that third level of carnivory. We see that they're getting a very small subset of energy that was initially in these plants, right? So as we go up, right, as food is being eaten and consumed, and then in turn consumed by other animals, we're losing that energy. It's this imperfect energy transfer. These carnivores have to eat quite a few individuals to get as much energy as, say, that the plants originally had, right? The last topic I want to touch upon kind of plays into that, right? But in an opposite way, right? It would be biomagnification. And so this is where instead of inefficient energy transfer, where you get less energy, right? This is where you might be looking at a very specific molecule and seeing how it might accumulate in organisms' bodies as we get higher up in the food chain. Really great example of this is DDT, right, which was a chemical used in the States here. Right? It's really persistent in the environment. It's very soluble, or it's not very soluble in water, but it's high in fats, right? And in the water, we see that it has this really low concentration of 0.0000003 parts per million, right? But then that zooplankton, those microscopic organisms in the water, they will consume some of that DDT, so it accumulates in their bodies. So now it's at 0.4 parts per million. Fish are going to eat that phytoplankton and accumulate the DDT in their bodies, so now it's at 0.5 parts per million. By the time it gets all the way up to these birds, like these ospreys, right, they might have like 25 parts per million in their body, which is bad ecologically because this particular chemical can cause eggshell formation just to not occur properly, right? So essentially those eggshells are really weak. The bird sits on them like they do in a nest, and instead of it being sturdy, it's going to collapse. We're not going to get osprey, right? This is the chemical that led to the downfall of a lot of eagles, right? But once it was banned, we saw those populations produce and replace itself. Now we have a large population of eagles. All right, so it was banned in the 1970s, but it's still used in other countries, and it's a great example of how a chemical can accumulate over time the further up you go in a food web. Do we have any questions? All right, that is the last of the content. All right, you are now done with content. You do have a scientific literacy assignment due on Wednesday. We'll do a review session, and on that final exam, a week from today.